In this video, we're going to be discussing the most gimmicky boss fights that have been ever added to WoW so far. And by gimmicky, we mean mechanics that are abnormal and odd, with how they work or what they require you to do. An honorable mention would be the Flame Leviathan, for example. And at number 10, we have the Council of Blood. Council of Blood is a fight in Castle Nathra that consists of 3 bosses. When one of them is killed, the rest heal to full health and gain a new ability. Each boss has their own unique and interesting abilities. However, one of them, which was really annoying and easy to mess up, was an ability called Dark Recital. When the bosses cast this ability, it linked players together and dealt damage to both of them while they were more than a certain distance apart, along with leaving pools on the floor which exploded and dealt a buttload of damage. Meaning you needed to quickly rush to your partner, and both of you run constantly to avoid standing in the exploding pools left behind, while also being careful not to run these explosions through the raid. Once a boss hit 50% health, that would activate the dance phase. With this phase, a beam of light spawned for every player within specific tiles within the checkered board floor on the room, and you then had to go and stand in it with an NPC flooding the remaining tiles. The trick was to follow the commands given to move left, right, forward, or backwards one tile, taking damage from the other dancers if you did not do it right. But if you did do it right, you gained a nice haste buff that stacked for each correct movement. Once this phase was over, you could then return to DPSing the boss. And while there isn't an official order to kill the bosses, as really any order would do, saving Stavros for last was the best option for normal and heroic because his last phase of sorts was easier than the other 2 bosses. And that's possibly the same case for Mythic now too, since we have outclassed the raid a lot and can easily make the DPS checks that we couldn't make before. With that being said, when 2 of the 3 bosses died, the remaining boss would gain even more abilities, and with Stavros in particular, he would spawn untargetable NPCs who would cross the dance floor and deal obscene amounts of damage to anyone who was hit by them. This was difficult and you had to dodge this while dealing with the dreadlings throwing wine at the raid and preparing to move around for the next dance recital. This may sound bad for players who've never raided here before, however, Castle Nathra is one of the better raids that Blizzard created and was well received by the community, which is rare in itself that the community says anything positive about the game. And this fight was actually pretty well liked, even if it was gimmicky, as the haste buff given from the dance phase more than made up for the lost time from being forced to dance. It's just that this one dancing part was rather gimmicky in an overall well-made fight. And at number 9, we have Malygos. With Blizzard's new addition of the vehicle combat system, which we have a video on that I highly recommend checking out, Blizzard added many fights both in the world, in dungeons, and raids, and even in PvP, which use these vehicles, with Malygos being one of the first people would experience in Wrath of the Lich King. The first phase of Malygos was quite simple with the basic mechanics that you might see throughout a raid, but during his second phase he spawned Nexus Lords and Scions that flew around on dismounts and attacked everyone. Once Malygos entered phase 3 after all the ads were killed, the platform the raid took place on would explode and the entire raid would drop into the abyss of space, before being saved by Alex Strauss's Red Dragonflight, initiating mounted combat. While the mechanics used in this phase were very easy, the reason why the community was very heavily against mounted combat was the sheer clunkiness of it. Very similar to underwater combat, the use of 6 directions instead of the usual 4 was quite jarring to players. Along with the phase requiring players to quickly spread and stack with the Arcane Pulse and Static Field abilities, it could be quite annoying, especially since many raid frames at the time would just tell you the vehicle's name and not the specific player's name. Admittedly, this phase didn't last very long, it was pretty easy to do, so unless you messed up bad, it was almost a guaranteed kill once you got there. But for a lot of players, seeing Malygos, who was a very important lore character in WoW's history, reduced to a mediocre and hated boss fight by the community was quite sad, especially since Wrath of the Lich King had many amazing boss fights. And at number 8, we have the Vault of the Wardens. The reason why this makes this list is because of a certain mechanic that happened at the final boss in the series of hallways before it, where you could only progress if you used an Orb of Light. Once you defeated the first 4 bosses, the group had to go down an elevator that would present them with an Orb of Light that was required to be used in order to progress onto the last boss. Hiding in the darkness were a bunch of spiders and Ghost of Wardens who were unattackable unless exposed to the light. There was a way to skip this mechanic using some class abilities, like Flare for Hunters, but with a short duration and long cooldown, made the Orb of Light necessary. The tedious part about this mechanic was the spiders running away from the Orb of Light carrier and going back into the darkness, with the groups of spider being able to attack the group from the darkness, running around constantly trying not to die, while maintaining the right distance to the mobs in order to even damage them at all, made this quite a pain to do. Along with the Wardens being able to high jump you across the area, possibly making the Orb of Light carrier go out of position and pull other mobs in the process. The orb could be thrown to counter this, but even when completing the area, the orbs were also required to fight the last boss. There, you were required to use it in order to reveal ads and even the boss to be able to damage them, and also in order to soak mechanics and dodge walls of spirits that were only visible when first summoned, or while near the Orb of Light. When going through the door that led to the final boss, the orbs gained when clearing the final area would be taken away from the group, but for some time it was actually possible to throw the orb past the line, and cheese the fight by having multiple light sources throughout the boss fight, making it a cakewalk. But since being fixed, you are required to do the fight as normal with only one orb. And at number 7, we have Immerseus. Immerseus is the first boss in the Siege of Orgrimmar that players encounter very soon after entering the raid. He has only 2 phases. In his first phase, there isn't anything too special besides him knocking players back with a rotating water ray, constant AoE zones, and possibly shooting them in the air with tornadoes. This boss is special in that players end up not actually killing the boss. See, the second phase when the boss hits 0 health, and instead of dying, explodes into water globs that fly across to the edge of the room, either corrupted globs or purified globs. The corrupted globs need to be killed by DPS, while purified globs need to be healed, as they quickly approach the center of the room and need to be fully emptied or filled before reaching the center. Each one fully healed or killed decreases the boss's total HP when it spawns, making the later phases faster and faster, eventually leading to the boss being defeated. With a really uninteresting and quite honestly obnoxious first phase, this boss overall is not a great first boss. And while there is many worse, this one is kind of a drag, especially when trying to solo the raid these days, as it takes killing multiple times and running around killing globs to finally beat the boss. To speed up the soloing of Immerseus, players can eat an item called fried bonefish, which increases your movement speed whenever you kill a mob, making this boss a breeze, seeing as almost all the water globs can be killed in a single run. Although some classes have horrible movement and need the food to help speed up the fight, some classes just have so much innate movement speed and this boss is a cakewalk anyways. So depending on what class you are, this might be pretty quick or very tedious to solo. And at number 6, we have Spoils of Pandaria. Spoils of Pandaria is another boss in the Siege of Orgrimmar and requires the raid to be split into 2 groups to complete. During this fight, both groups must destroy boxes of varying sizes to either get Mantid or Mogu mods to spawn, then being required to kill the mob spawn from said boxes. The mobs that did spawn in the boxes had varying different strengths, abilities, and difficulties, with the biggest box holding the biggest threats, but also gave you the most energy. See, there are these meters that appear on your front of your screen that fill up whenever mobs on that side were defeated, and both sides had to kill enough mobs in their own room in order to get their bar to fill up. However, you couldn't just open all of the boxes at once and AoE the mobs down, seeing as some of them hit really hard, like the Spark of Life, and would very easily wipe that side of the room if not handled correctly. Once they're both filled, you could pull a lever on each side of the gate and it would unlock, allowing the group to go to the next room, which requires players to do the exact same things they did before. However, this fight was unique because it was not only a timed encounter, but there really wasn't a boss. Similar to in rage encounters where after a set amount of time the boss enrages, for this fight, after the time expires, the room simply exploded and instantly killed everyone. Splitting up groups on either side was extremely important, seeing as if one group didn't have enough damage or good enough healing to defeat it, it could hold back the rest of the progress and possibly wipe the raid from that lost time. There was a way to send players over to the weaker side via a chain, but the more people on one side of a group would hold back the other one. So deciding who goes where beforehand was probably the most difficult part of the entire encounter. And at number 5, we have Iron Maidens. The Iron Maidens was a set of bosses within the Blackrock Foundry raid, and the 3 of them had a lot of stuff going on. From dealing with the 3 bosses' own mechanics, to riding chains across to a ship and fighting mini-bosses there to set the barrages of cannons, dodging whirling tornadoes around the map, and a really long fight to boot. There were some interesting mechanics that the group had to deal with from the bosses, like the penetrating shot, rapid fire, blade dash, or tornadoes that would spawn around the area. Every couple of minutes, one of the bosses would leap over to the ship and begin firing non-stop barrages of cannon fire at the boss platform. And depending on what boss went over there would be different ads. The 6 players had to kill the mini-boss on the ship, then sabotage the cannon, stopping the assault before launching back to the regular platform to continue fighting the bosses. For the rest of the raid, however, they were forced to deal with the other 2 bosses and their mechanics, as well as a barrage of bombs that covered randomly half the arena, only to quickly require you to move to the explosion's location to dodge the next barrage at the empty locations from the flurry before. While the fight was gimmicky and tricky at times, it was also very long, and there wasn't really much to do if you weren't in the group that jumped over to the ship. So it wasn't a super well-liked boss fight and a pretty well-liked raid. And at number 4, we have Dark Animus. During this boss fight, you need to kill golems, and there's 3 types of them. Small ones called anima golems, medium ones called large anima golems, and large ones called the massive anima golems. But at the start of the fight, only the small ones are active. Raids will require a lot of their raid members besides just their tanks to pick up some of the smaller ads because they had an ability called Acceleration Link. That made the robots do a ton more damage and get a movement speed buff if they were too close to each other, so you just had to have a whole bunch of people tanking them really far apart in the room. And this could very quickly lead to a snowballing of wiping, as if a single player died, it could lead their golem running to another one and buffing each other and killing their targets and then quickly falling out of control. Also, if the ads are killed too closely to the boss, it will cause the larger ads, or even the boss itself, to start, making positioning extremely important when fighting here. Killing the smaller robots causes the anima inside of them to jump to the nearest one, with the medium robots activating once their anima pool is full, and the big robots, as well as the boss, activating as soon as they receive any anima at all, with each of the adds having their own specific abilities, which they use as soon as they're active. So the strategy to this fight was to kill the small robots near the medium robots, and then the medium robots near the large one, and then to keep the largest one alive while you kill the boss, as the boss will steal a set amount of anima from each golem active every 6 seconds, and having 25 small golems active would give him 25 anima, while only having 2 massive golems active will only give him 2. And since the boss reaching 100 energy would instantly wipe the raid, this was to be avoided at all costs. However, that was not all, as the boss has several abilities which are unlocked by his anima levels, and some other annoying mechanics, like a raid-wide interrupt and silence, spreading debuffs, constant dot damage, and that is not even considering the abilities of the adds, like the massive golems who swap players' locations need to be quickly dispelled or risk killing both players. The major issue with this was if a single mob died too closely to the boss, it could easily mess up the entire fight by having the boss activate early while tons of smaller golems are alive, allowing the boss to very quickly drain them of energy, and that's where most of the wipes in this boss happened. This wasn't really a boss fight as much as it was a fight against the adds, with the boss being the side thing instead of the main attraction. And at number 3, we have the Desolate Host. This boss is pretty unique, with there being 2 areas to fight this one boss, both taking place in the same room. One of them being the corporeal area where the group started, and then the spirit area, which was accessible by clicking fonts around the edge of the room, with both of these areas having their own boss and own adds that spawned and needed to be killed. If no players were in that said area, the bosses would basically just wipe the raid. If 2 players were next to each other in these separate areas, they would do damage to each other, which required extra planning to see who would get what side of the room to avoid this mechanic as best as they could. The main thing with this boss was to almost area dance by having one certain mechanic appear on the corporeal side, using it to deal with mechanics on the spirit side, and vice versa. Making good timing required, as timing and position on this fight was the most important thing with beating it. With this entire raid being one of the most difficult ones added in quite a long time, and with the confusing area mechanic requiring to beat this fight successfully, it often left a lot of players scratching their heads, as the raid could very easily be wiped if someone messed up a single thing. And at number 2, we have Queen Azshara. This fight is not only long and full of mechanics, but also has a heavy reliance on line of sight. This fight contains 4 phases with 2 intermissions, making it an obscenely complex encounter. The first phase has you fight a pair of Naga lovebirds who have phases of needing to see each other and not seeing each other. These 2 need to be tanked by separate tanks, but also swap every so often and either brought into or out of line of sight of each other, using the pillars in the side of the room depending on if they're longing for each other or having painful memories. This fight also has constant spawning adds that need to be killed before they can reach the center of the room, with various CC abilities able to be used to help this at least, some even needing to be hit by abilities from other adds, like the Charged Spear, which pierces through all targets, while also needing to make sure those pierce abilities do not hit multiple people, explosions are hidden behind pillars, and everyone hides when the boss explodes. For example, the Arcane Burst ability, which is a debuff Azshara would place onto random members, which required them to run behind pillars to then be dispelled, dealing damage to everyone in their line of sight. So many groups would bring 2 warlocks for Mythic in order to have their imp do the dispel, that way their healer would not take a ton of damage each time they dispelled that target. But that isn't even all, you need to also make sure arcane orbs are soaked by lots of the raid, and players run away from beacon. Not even mentioning the decree phases, these phases apply commands to the entire raid with various effects like soak an orb, don't soak an orb, stand with allies, don't stand with allies, don't move, run around, and if you fail these effects, you take ever increasing damage, which can get quite hectic for an entire raid to work together to help people, for example, who need to stack with allies but cannot move. There's also wards around the room. These wards are runes upon the floor that are constantly drained throughout the fight by Azshara and her adds, which need to be charged by standing on them, which applies a debuff that reduces your maximum health the longer you stand upon it, the more energy you refill, but also the lower your maximum health, requiring everyone in the raid to soak the wards multiple times, for if they reach 0 energy, it's basically a wipe. Even though this fight was amazing thematically, and an encounter that felt as it should for Azshara, this entire fight was a nightmare of countless adds, line of sight mechanics, map effects, resource management, debuff management, health management, and 4 phases with 2 intermission phases. And while LOS is common in PvP, and it has been used in the past in various raids and dungeons, no boss has used LOS to this extreme extent, on top of the other countless mechanics. And lastly, at number 1, we have a rather recent boss, first seen within the Towers of Torghast, where you gained random anima powers to increase your power. This beast, called the Tarragrue, would hunt you down upon sensing you die too many times. And while various ability combos allowed you to cheese a kill out of it, it would not truly be killed until 9.1 within the Sanctum of Domination raid, where he acts as the first boss in the raid. While the mechanics of this boss itself are rather basic, like chains that stun the first person hit by them, a shadow phase where you need to run to the light patches, AoE fears around random players, various debuffs placed around the room that need to be sucked by players' random dots, and an enrage. So what makes this so gimmicky? Well, Sanctum of Domination did a great job of referencing past mechanics and characters within the game. Sylvanas with references to her Heroes of the Storm abilities, Shadowland Cinematic, and the Broken Shore, a key point in her life. Kel'Thuzad with references to his past Naxxramas fights and Heroes of the Storm abilities, and the Eye of the Jailer referencing its abilities called upon you within the Maw. They too reference the Tarragrue by allowing you, before the boss fight, to clear 4 large trash mobs around the boss arena, allowing every player to select 4 separate anima powers, each orb giving you one of 3 choices, randomized each time, with pillars near the boss entry to let you reset the powers if you really hate your choices. These anima powers allowed you to massively customize your playstyle and role during the fight. And while unlike Torghast, none of these powers were class or spec specific, while many of these abilities are random, like Tremor Blast Heart, which increases your primary stat and gives you passive health regen, or Valara's Cape of Subterfuge, which causes you to randomly reduce the threat and gain 50% crit for 6 seconds. Many of these abilities played a massive role in the fight. For example, the disembodied Mystic Hands allowed your attacks to randomly steal a buff from the boss, which allowed you to steal the boss's enrage, massively increasing your DPS. Ever-Beating Heart makes you immune to fear and stun, allowing you to step near fearing allies, or soak the chain ability to prevent people from being stunned. Or Unstable Form, which randomly reduces damage taken by 99% and reduces the stack of a debuff, which is very important on Mythic mode where the soak debuffs do not have a timer. And while most of them do not have a direct effects on the fight itself, there are some quite interesting combos you can create with these effects. For example, Blade of the Life Taker, which causes your attacks to steal health equal to 10% of your maximum health. Pair that with Alethium Weights, which increases all 4 primary stats by 30%, including Stamina. Toblerone Endurance increases your maximum health by 45%, and Potent Acid Gland, randomly dealing damage, while also increasing the damage you deal to them by 25% for 8 seconds. These abilities altogether cause the vast majority of DPS to simply be the Blade of the Life Taker, especially if you played a class with high health like a Warlock, and would deal tens of thousands of damage for every couple of seconds, while also healing yourself for the same amount, with the boss eventually entering a kiting phase, where it removes all your powers and simply needs to be kited around the room as it fixates on one person and will one-shot you if it reaches you like it did back in Torghast, leading to the final DPS race. This fight is the most gimmicky because of the random nature of its anima powers. How these odd anima combos and builds could be made within the fight itself by choosing specific series of powers, and how these choices could affect your spec, class, or even role within the fight. Do you focus on clearing debuffs? Do you focus on stealing the enrage? Do you focus on soaking the stun, buffing the raid? Or are you a troll who chooses tens of towers, which gives you a minor buff, but also stuns the entire raid for 10 seconds if you die? Or Lumbering Form, where you gain a larger buff, but a knockback anyone that you step near, for sure leading to at least some untimely deaths. While this is an easy fight in comparison to one like Azshara, there is no fight more gimmicky than the Lord of Torghast, the Tarragrue. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other gimmicky boss fights we may have missed, go ahead and leave those down in the comments for a potential part 2.